My name is Blair Lee, and I want to welcome you to the 2018 Secular Eclectic Academic Homeschoolers Online Conference for School Choice Week. I want to thank our friends at Sequential Spelling for sponsoring this conference and for providing cool giveaways each day for all the people who comment on any of the talks. Now, I actually use Sequential Spelling with my son, and we love it. So I was really excited when Sequential Spelling asked if they could be a sponsor for this conference. They are, through sponsoring this conference, they're making all the talks free to all the listeners, which was really exciting. If you're looking for a good spelling program, I recommend it highly. This year, the focus of the talks is on homeschooling children across the learning spectrum. Our goal with our online conferences is to provide support for our community. Now, I've been homeschooling for 12 years, and during that time, I have observed profound benefits for children who are homeschooled who were on the learning spectrum. So we wanted to help provide support to this segment of our community. So I want to kick off the conference with a personal story about part of my family's journey. In 2011, while participating in a ski jumping competition, my son had a serious accident that resulted in a traumatic brain injury that caused him to have a complex concussion. I'm going to be honest with you. What I'm going to talk about, a lot of this is painful to talk about even now. There just is, it was something else. I was standing on the sidelines watching. There's absolutely no way to plan for something like this, something like a complex concussion. And no one who has ever loved someone who has had post-concussive syndrome or who has suffered from the effects of a complex concussion expects it. It's just something that comes out of the blue. One day you have one person who behaves one way, and then they hit their head, and the next day you have someone else who behaves differently. So I decided to talk about this, even though it is. When I was talking to my son about it yesterday, I teared up, and he said to me, in some ways, Mom, I think this was harder for you than me, because I don't remember whole periods of it. Well, so I decided to talk about this at this conference because if this is something you're going through, it can be a lonely, tough time for a parent. And I think it's important to know that you are not alone. Sean has been lucky. His brain did heal. The story I'm going to tell you is not something that ends, that it's a success story. Through trial, error, some tears on my part, and hard work from Sean, and a lot of planning from me, Sean is doing great academically. It also took some real innovation with a real focus on how he best learned, not on how material was recommended to be presented, because at the end of the day, when you've got somebody who's struggling to learn, it really changes the focus to how they are accessing information. So I'm going to share. Within this, I'm going to weave this tale, what happened, and then I'm going to share some of what we did academically. I'm not going to come up with a plan because I really think each child is individual. Although I must tell you, this is on my, as many of you know, I'm a writer, and I have quite a year of writing planned. The topic of this is not one of the books I have planned, but I think eventually this is something that I will write. I just really think it's important that people who that people begin to speak up about how they dealt with it when their child had a complex concussion. They're much more common than we realize, I think people are just starting to become really aware of this issue, of the importance of dealing with this issue. So I want to share with you what we did academically, and really how I planned it and what Sean did academically. Because despite missing what, if I add it all together, probably amounts to 2 years of school, at the age of 18, Sean is exactly where he should be academically. For another reason, he will graduate in December of 2018. But this year is our first year that, and so I really have an understanding of where he is, because this year's the first year that we didn't homeschool at home, all of his work at home. And he's been taking classes at a charter school where the teachers give him grades. He's taking honors physics, pre-calculus, and creative writing, in addition to Spanish and filmmaking, and he is doing really well in all his classes. So I know that he's managed to get back on track. We put him in a more traditional, still pretty eclectic, but Sean wants to go to college, and so we wanted him to, I call it a scaffolding. We're scaffolding him into a more traditional path. So back to 2011, when my then 11-year-old had been skiing competitively for several years. We lived in a ski town. Everybody in our immediate family and most of our friends skied. Along with about 100 other spectators, I watched my son going backwards into a jump, something called going in switch. He over-rotated, so he came down backward, came up to the jump, over-rotated, and came down on his helmet. He broke his nose and the helmet, by the way, saved his life. There was blood everywhere from the broken nose, but other than that, there was no obvious damage. And of course, this is anyone who's had a concussion, a serious concussion, knows it makes it really hard to assess how badly injured someone is because there's no obvious damage. And even with the scan that they do, they're looking for bleeding on the brain. Sean had none of that. So there was a doctor watching Sean crash. This was the CTC was after. There was a doctor watching. He ran out to where Sean landed. Very soon after that, Sean was taken by stretcher to an ambulance and then to a hospital. When Sean crashed, he passed out, and in the hospital he began vomiting. He vomited before he got to the hospital as well. In case you didn't know, those are two signs for kids that they have experienced a blow to the head that has led them to sustain a complex concussion, passing out, and for kids vomiting. Adults often don't vomit, but kids vomit usually. The emergency room doctor told us that Sean had a concussion and to keep an eye on him for a couple of weeks, but he didn't give us any extensive instructions beyond that. Now, almost right away, I realized that something really serious had happened. Now, nowadays, there are a lot of conversations about complex concussions, but there wasn't that sort of conversation going on 7 years ago. When I looked online, there were very few resources, and most of those didn't have extensive information, especially for children who have sustained a concussion. So the day after the crash, we took a walk with Sean. We've got dogs, we were just taking them out to go to the bathroom. Sean who had been a competitive athlete for several years, and he struggled to walk half a block. I had no idea why. I now know that one of the things that happens to someone who has sustained a concussion is that their physical abilities suffer, even if they have an injured part of their body. The brain is taking everything in order to heal, to the detriment of physical abilities and mental as well, but the physical abilities really shut down. And so Sean was exhausted just going from one room in our house to another. We had stairs in the house. It was weeks before Sean could manage to get up the stairs without help. Sean was in the wreck on a Saturday, and on Tuesday I took Sean to see a doctor who had been trained by the U.S. ski team in how to treat people who, well, sure, because a kid's brain is still growing and developing, and of course it would heal better. And he told me that no, that wasn't the reason. The reason, he said, that kids are more likely to heal is because they have parents who are much more likely to follow the doctor's orders to the letter. That adults often go back too early to doing activities, especially athletic adults, than children, because there's no one to tell an adult that they can't. This is something that I took to heart, even when it made me feel a little neurotically nervous to do so. You see, the next thing he asked me was how well Sean was doing in school. I told him that Sean was doing great in school. We'd always homeschooled, what I like to think of as a page width above where Sean was at in his studies. And doing this had led to Sean being above grade level in most subjects. On a couple subjects he was at grade level, but everything he was doing great. The doctor told me that was really good because Sean was going to need to take weeks to months off of school until his brain fully healed. Sean wasn't to read. I can laugh now because I'm laughing at how neurotic this made me over the following weeks. I'm laughing at myself. But, my husband always says, hindsight's 20/20. That time I was so worried. Sean wasn't to read. He wasn't to watch any TV shows that were not light and fluffy. In other words, no educational programming. Sean began sneaking out first thing in the morning to watching things like Liberty Kids in the following weeks to months. Sean couldn't play any video games, no books on tape, nothing that required a great deal of concentration. In addition to that, there would be no athletics. This was, it was tough. It was a long few months. But, so I'm going to be honest and tell you what I was laughing about through most of that, because it wasn't funny at all. I was beyond worried. In some ways, I think it might have changed my personality a little. Made me way less carefree. I'm going to be honest and tell you that up to that point, I was always the academic type of homeschooler. We could be pretty loose within that framework, but I was very academic even when we were being loose. When Sean had to take all this time off school, I began to stress. I began playing the what-if game. After somebody has sustained a complex concussion, more than just their ability, there's more than just, there's a radical change in personality. Those changes include anger, insomnia, headaches, anxiety, and for Sean, he became very picky about what he ate, something that he had never been before. He was always one of those really sunny, easygoing types. Now, I've got 3 stepchildren, and one of whom was really sunny, 2 of whom were not as sunny. And so I knew how to parent kids that were not as easygoing as Sean, but it was quite a radical change to all of the sudden have to change the relationship, because he really, it wasn't just for a brief period of time, it was for an extended period of time that his personality really changed. So you have me worrying about him missing school, and you have this totally grouchy, bored child and who I'm worried sick about. It was a really tough time. And if you are going through this, I empathize with you. I'm going to give you a virtual hug. There's the only way through it is through it. You just trial by fire. By the end of the first month after the crash, now to the academic side. By the end of the first month after the crash, I began asking Sean simple math problems. Things that he could have, so what I found was things that he could easily have been doing for many years. I started doing little teeny mini quizzes. I asked him 2 or 3 math problems. At first he couldn't do them. We're talking basic multiplication, that sort of thing. As long as Sean was struggling to do these simple problems, I insisted that he continue to take time off. Sean crashed in January. We didn't get back to school until late August of 2011. By July, he was ready to go back to school. All his friends, most of Sean's friends were friends from the ski team, and they didn't go back to school until August, so I let Sean take off until August. When he did go back, it was totally as if he had never sustained a complex concussion. Then in January of 2012, Sean hit his head again. It was much less severe than the first time, but he sustained another complex concussion, the effects of which, having followed so soon after the first concussion, were much, much worse. Sean did not fully recover from this second impact until 2016. Our first assumption was to do what we had done the first time, and that Sean would be okay sometime in the summer. It was also at this point that during the summer, that we moved away from the ski town that we had lived in, where Sean grew up, and we moved to San Diego, where it never snows. I still miss living in our ski town sometimes, but I could not handle living in a ski town anymore. By July of 2012, it was clear to me that the recovery for this was going to be much longer than it had been for the first concussion. I want to be honest with you, and it's one of the reasons that I'm telling this story. I've mentioned it a couple of times. It was a lonely time. I struggled to find people who had been through what we were going through. And I honestly had no idea a lot of the time what to do. I was so far out of my comfort zone and my skill set that I sometimes just would get a stress headache from not knowing what to do. Interestingly enough, my understanding of my like sort of obsessive what do I do now really and my understanding of the need to have support and know that you're not alone in this part of your journey is why we're hosting this conference in School Choice Week this week. How this specific area, homeschooling children across the learning spectrum, turned to be. Because I want to make sure all of you feel that you have a support network. Back on topic. For the next 4.5 years, Sean was plagued with headaches, debilitating, curl up on his bed in the fetal position with all the blinds drawn headaches. If you've ever experienced migraines, you know that what Sean was going through. Unfortunately, the first neurologist that we saw thought that Sean's headaches were migraines. I say unfortunately because the medicine prescribed for migraines, at least for Sean, I've heard it's the case for some other people, triggered headaches. It was the sort of medication that in order to know if it works, you have to increase the dose over time. And then when you realize it's not working, you have to decrease the medicine slowly over time. We tried several of these medicines and spent some time investigating this line of medications. It was a really long time, and it made Sean phobic actually to try treatments after trying these treatments that had actually been headache triggers. But eventually I found a neurologist who worked in pediatrics with children who suffered from concussions. This neurologist was involved in a study that was being funded by the NFL looking at post-concussive syndrome, which is what Sean at this point had. Post-concussive syndrome is a set of symptoms that may continue for weeks, months, or a year. And in my son, and they're coming to understand, many people's case can last for more than 1 year. In Sean's case, it lasted for 5 years, 4.5 years. Sean began participating in this study. They were looking for kids who had been identified right away as having complex concussion and who had gotten immediate medical treatment for their concussion, whose parents had then very carefully followed the protocol set out by a doctor, who even with all of that had post-concussive syndrome. This neurologist and this study is what led to the eventual treatment that finally ended Sean's headaches. So if this is something you're dealing with, I cannot recommend enough finding a doctor a pediatrician who works with kids who have post-concussive syndrome. So I had a child who would go for periods where he could not do any academics, and there was no way to plan when he would have a headache or not, or whether the headaches would last for 1 day or span several days. In addition to the need to take periods of time off that could not be planned for, Sean's skill set and the way he accessed information had changed. In addition to all of that, sometimes he would have a very low-grade headache and he would want to do school during those periods of time, but when Sean was suffering from a headache at any level, it really affected how the level he could access information at. So even when we were doing school, there would be a big range of what level he could access the information at. So Sean's skill sets, the area of his brain, for some discipline, came back on, what I always thought of as came back online later than others. His artistic, creative side came back very early. Interestingly enough, computer programming, which he had always thought was insanely boring, he all of a sudden found interesting and very doable. And he really got into focusing on that. Math was not so much, and so what did we do? Well, early on in this period, we moved through necessity from a more structured approach to an interest-focused approach, even within the core subjects. I found that I needed to do this. So we would often go for a period of time and everything would be going great. And then in the middle of learning a topic, without warning, Sean would have several days of headaches. I found that it made a big difference to where we were able to pick up how engaged Sean was in the material when we stopped. This actually makes sense. So for instance, with math, Sean was struggling with geometry. For some reason, even though he was really came back with computer programming, the artistic side, that sort of spatial reasoning didn't come back online as quickly. So I picked up a book but he was fascinated with astronomy. At the time, I was just finishing I had finished an astronomy course. It was not out for publication yet. Sean worked his way through it. I picked up a book about college math for astronomy or something like that. If you email me and you care about this title, I'll look up the title, but it escapes me at this time. I was able to get Sean doing really high level math using astronomy, and so that's what I mean by we used an interest focused approach for math at that time. And so because of that, we were able to pick it up because we'd been weaving it through astronomy. We also began doing a lot of project-based learning because of that. So within a project, you might not be interested in parts of it, but you can always find something to bring into the project to make it interesting. So for instance, with the math, a project-based approach to math where there's this focus on astronomy, weaving the math into the astronomy and applying it to astronomy, really, even though Sean didn't love, he actually at the end of that said, I actually really like math when there's a reason for me studying it. It was very interesting to find that. And so that affected how well, how we could get more, how within a shortened amount of time, it was sort of like concentrating the learning in a shorter amount of time by getting him more engaged in the material. I also found that along those lines, I found it made a big difference how much time was spent applying information. Now, I've been writing a long time. I've been writing science courses for over a decade. I've been writing a long time about the importance of so when you learn science, there's always a reading part that I call the theory. How well you learn the theory directly relates to how soon you do a meaningful application of that theory. In other words, a lab or activity. So this direct application of information after studying a topic, I've known it really benefits a student. So I use that same approach to Sean for his other subjects. And I came to understand what a huge difference this makes working with someone who has ups and downs in how well and how effectively they can access information, especially if they have a very haphazard schedule. I'm going to give you some take-home advice on the academic side. If your child needs to take time off academics, do not stress it. You might feel like that's easily said, and as you know from my story, I didn't always not stress about it. I would change that if I could. Just take the time off. This can be hard, I'm not going to lie, but it is beyond your control how much time it takes for your child, his or her brain, to heal. When your child starts academics again, be very attuned to how he or she is accessing information. You might need to help them find new ways to do their work. Sean's neurologist gave me this analogy. So you're used to think of this as there's one way you like to take to and from work every day. It's usually going to be, let's say it's the highway, and if there's no traffic, that's the fastest way. But when the traffic is really terrible, sometimes an alternative route is going to be better. What happens with somebody who's sustained a complex concussion, and I've seen the MRI, they start to have spots where the material isn't flowing the way it used to. Eventually, new paths will be built. And they might take more time, go through a different route. But does it really matter if eventually they can get through that route? So by being very attuned, you can start to see when and where you need to help find new ways for your child to create new paths so that they can get from A to B in the answer to the material. An applied project-based approach can have profound profound benefits, and at least in our case, erase any issues caused by the shortened amount of learning time. There will probably be gaps when your child no longer has post-concussive syndrome or a complex concussion. That is something that can easily be fixed with tutoring. In fact, that's often what a tutor does. I've done a lot of tutoring in math and science, and I always liken tutoring to taking a fine-toothed comb through the material until you find the areas that is hanging the person up. I think of them as like tangles, and you've got this fine-tooth comb and you get to these tangles, and through helping fill in the gaps and untangling the information, that it often opens up understanding into many other areas. It often is one little thing down here can be affecting 3 or 4 things up here, especially if instead of one thing there's 2 or 3 things. If you have any questions for me about this, feel free to contact me at blair@chomeschoolers.com. If you leave comments to this in this post where this talk is, I will respond to each and every one of them. In addition, we have a conference coming up in Atlanta in 2018. That is what we're calling an in real life conference. If you have not been to an in-person conference, you don't know what you're missing. And this is a family-friendly event. There will be as much going on for the kids as there is for the adults. I live in California, and the conferences I go to in California are all family events. And the Homeschoolers conferences, like those, are family events. I really hope to meet you there. Our next online conference is in October 2018. The focus of that conference is STEAM, Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Math. Don't miss it. If you want to be someone in the audience, if you want to present a talk for our STEAM conference, feel free to submit a talk at any time. Thank you so much for listening to me today. We have 12 more talks scheduled over the next 5 days. I hope you enjoy them very much. Thank you.